With that, let me start into the talk. I want to show you a picture of Hamburg, which is totally not appropriate to the season at the moment, but it's good to introduce my talk. Namely, it shows the local lake of Hamburg, the Außenalster, frozen over, which only happens relatively rarely. It's last time in 2010 or 2012. And what you can see is a flat, yes?
Any Carlos.
You can see people sliding across the lake only in 2 dimensions. The third dimension is more or less frozen out in the sense that they only move in 2 dimensions. And they seem to be enjoying themselves quite a lot, you know, this pleasure of ice skating, and also tend to form bunches a lot, even though there's no mulled wine sold at that point of time. So that's evocative of many of the central themes of my talk today. I will talk about 2D gases, where gases are cooled to nanokelvin temperatures and the motion is frozen out in the vertical direction entirely. In particular, I will talk about how Cooper pairs form and these gases turn superfluid. Why do we do this? Because at least I find it fascinating to understand strongly correlated superfluidity, particularly in low dimension. But strongly correlated systems, we've heard about them in part from Nina Von, Denis Lacroix, and the topics I'm presenting here are also closely related to the upcoming talks by Yvan Castin, Sandro Stringari, and in particularly Senne van Loon. Particularly intriguing questions, to my mind, are the questions, what actually determines the superfluidity, the stability of such superfluids and superconductors, and what is the role of dimensionality in these systems and to determine this stability? And why should dimensionality matter at all? And for that, let me go to the next slide where you can see that, well, basically the Hohenberg-Mermin-Wagner theorem rules out long-range order in Bose and Fermi systems, so phase coherence, at least if they're infinitely large and at finite temperature. And while the mathematical proof is quite involved and certainly beyond me, an intuition can be gotten by looking at the density of states as compared to here the density of states as compared to the energy. And in 3D, the density of states is a square root behavior, whereas in 2D, it's constant. And we can already see that there are a lot more thermal excitations or low energy modes available for thermal excitations than in 3D. And correspondingly, in 2D, it should be easier to scramble the order, the long range order. At the same time, Berezinski, Kosterlitz, and Thouless showed us that these systems can become superfluid nevertheless below a certain critical temperature. So the take-home message is, well, 2D systems can still become superfluid, but it should intuitively be harder due to this abundance of phase fluctuations, which can scramble the order. But we can also turn it around a bit and going to the next graph, look at solid state materials, where you can see here the typical material, solid state material, where red dots and blue, not solid state material, strongly correlated superconductors, so cuprate superconductors, which has typically these 2D planes made up out of red dots, green balls, copper and oxide, and most of the motion of these systems is within these planes. And so they feature particularly high temperatures for the transition, and it's a bit questionable. Why is that so? Why is it particularly 2D systems where one would think that the phase fluctuations disturb these systems? And to illustrate my point further, let me show you a plot here on the right side, where the idea of it is about 30 years old, the famous Uemura plot. This particular iteration is a relatively modern one, where I plot the critical temperature of high temperature superconductors versus the Fermi temperature. And then I've taken the liberty to color materials or data points from actual materials which have predominantly 2D structures in blue, whereas materials which are more 3-dimensional in red. And there's 2 ways to then read this plot. One of them is to say, well, the ones with the highest absolute critical temperatures are more predominantly 2D materials or materials with 2D planes. But another way of saying is to look at the ratio of critical temperature over Fermi temperature, so the relative critical temperature. And for example, this dashed line shows a relative critical temperature of 10%. of critical temperature to the Fermi temperature. And there we see 2D materials approach this line particularly closely, but also 3D materials come quite close. And when looking at all these materials which come close, they share a common set of features. Namely, they have particularly strong interactions, short coherence lengths, despite the fact that they have very different geometries, different dimensionalities, different coupling mechanisms. Some of them are cuprates, some of them are pnictides, some of them are, Moiré, van der Waals, superconductors, and so on. So looking at this plot, we can ask ourselves, what is the role of reduced dimensionality? Does it really matter? Does it not matter? I mean, comparing the red to the blue data points. And is there a difference in stability between 2D and 3D systems? And I will try to tell you what we've been measuring about that in ultra-cold gases. So the way we do that is that our particular material of choice are ultra-cold gases cooled to nanokelvin temperatures, which are confined by a repulsive barrier here. So around here, we have a repulsive barrier, which keeps the gas in. The vertical direction of motion is frozen out because we have a trapping frequency vertically due to an optical lattice, which is larger than nearly all relevant energies of scale, certainly the temperature and the chemical potential. And the density is about 1 atom per micrometer squared. So if this is 60 micrometers by 60 micrometers, it gives a 3,600 micrometers or so. That would be about the number of atoms per micrometer. Somehow we confine it with 2 optical lattices, but this is a technical detail. And this has been pioneered, this idea of confining atoms in boxes, by the group of Zoran Hadžibabić, Martin Svirline, and several others. And in particular, Martin Svirline has also done this, and we now also, for so-called for 3-dimensional systems in the same machine. So this is a 2D system where all motion is frozen out. You see a single sheet or single plane, whereas here you see a 3D system, which looks a bit funny. It's a truncated cone. So think about a wizard's hat that you're cutting somewhere off. So it's a truncated cone with a homogeneous density, and this there's a wall, repulsive wall around it, and 2 end caps at the top of the bottom. So it's somehow created by that sort of 2 light potentials, circular light potentials. And the density is again the separation between atoms that's on the order of a microsecond. And these are the systems that we use to study. And and there's been quite a bit of previous work. Obviously, our group is not the first one to study such systems generally, so I'll only go over that quickly. So the first to really realize, for example, 2D gases has been the group of Mr. Turlapov and Chris Vail. Then several groups have used spectroscopy, in this case for cold atoms, radio frequency spectroscopy, and even variations of the so-called ARPAS, angle resolved photo emission spectroscopy equivalent in cold gases. I think the work that is most relevant here is the one by the Joachim group, where they measure the momentum distribution of these 2D gases. And if you take a Fourier transform of the momentum distribution, you get the G1 function. And in fact, they could observe that the G1 function in a log-log plot drops linearly, which means that actually G1 drops algebraically, although with a very funny exponent, which didn't correspond to theory. Anyway, and then there have been several works on equations of states, breathing modes, on imbalanced gases. And as I said, Martin Svirline has been the first to realize such inhomogeneous systems as shown you here before, such 3D homogeneous systems, 3D homogeneous systems. Hope I did not forget anything. And with that, let me come to the first part of my talk with scientific results. Namely, how do we probe superfluidity in a 2D Fermi gas? And the main idea is that we take this 2D Fermi gas that you can see here, sketch again here, and drag an impurity through it, namely a periodic potential that we can drag through it. And if the gas is superfluid, at low velocities of this impurity, this periodic impurity, as we drag it across, we should not be able to heat the gas because it flows in a superfluid fashion around the obstacle. And that is in fact what we observe. So here's a proxy for the temperature. The temperature increases when we drag this lattice through it. And here is the velocity with which we drag this periodic potential through the gas. And we see no heating up to a certain critical temperature, after which it increases then in a quadratic fashion. And that's the main idea that I'm going to tell you in a bit more detail about from now on, our main technique. So if we can probe these excitations, we really want to see the dispersion relation, and from that, perhaps the critical velocity. And Landau told us how to extract a critical velocity if we know dispersion relation. So the dispersion relation epsilon of Q, namely take the minimum of the value of the dispersion relation divided by the momentum or wave vector, and that gives you your critical velocity. So in a normal gas, where one has a quadratic dispersion relation, where this is the momentum and this is the energy, this minimum slope is obviously zero. And basically you can think about it in the way that to fulfill energy and momentum distributions, this straight line has to hit the dispersion relation. That's obviously possible for various slopes of the straight line, including zero, and hence the critical velocity is zero. Whereas if we now go for if we now go for a superfluid, which has a linear phonon branch to begin with and then turns quadratic, then the minimum slope where energy and momentum conservation are fulfilled is here this slope, and this would then give the critical velocity according to the Landau criterion. And then going even further to a BCS superfluid, where we also have to think about pair breaking excitations. So not say a Bose superfluid, but a Fermi superfluid, we would have this phononic branch, but then somewhere at about Kf, we could break two particles apart. And for that, we'd have to supply the energy to break these particles apart, which are protected by a many-body gap from breaking apart. This gap is called 2 delta. And so then the slope is given by this 2 delta and about Kf. And that's now what we set out to study. And there's been previous work studying critical velocities, for example, in 3D Bose gases. The first one very famous by the group of Wolfgang Ketterle, or then later Gretchen Campbell, Bill Phillips. Also in 2D Bose gases by a group of Jean Dalibard, and in 3D Fermi gases by the group of Wolfgang Ketterle again, my own group, and also Chris Vale's group. And so how do we do that in a bit more detail also for the colleagues from nuclear physics? I hope I can make it in such a way that it becomes clear. So here you can see that the potential, this is a picture of the light fields which we shine onto the atoms. So one of them is a round circular light field which keeps the atoms in this ring so they cannot move outside, and you can't see how they're trapped from top and bottom. And then we have two light beams coming in under a small angle, and these two light beams form this interference pattern that we can really see here. So this is just the light fields we shine in. And it forms this interference pattern, but by changing the angle of these two beams, we can change the periodicity of this light field. So here you can't even see the periodicity anymore. And for the experts, that's by sending the two light beams through a microscope objective and just changing the distance, and that changes the angle. And if we now take one light beam and the second light beam has a slightly different laser frequency, then this interference pattern will start to move. And that determines, and so basically the periodicity given by the angle will give us, by these angles will give us the periodicity and hence the allowed momentum transfer, whereas the speed, which is given by the slight frequency detuning, will give us the allowed energy transfer, or the energy transfer basically by the frequency. So we can determine by this frequency the energy transfer, and by the angle the momentum transfer allowed. And then we shine that onto our gases and measure the heating of a certain time. I didn't show you how we measure the heating, but we somehow let the gas fly for a while and see how fast it flies apart, and measure the extra energy, for example. And this, in fact, probes the structure factor, or at least to a close approximation, namely the structure factor. So how easy it is to create perturbations at a certain momentum and energy is just this heating divided by the energy that we supply by these detuned laser beams. And what we then see is that if we prepare a gas in the so-called Bose-Einstein regime, so very closely, this is a fermionic gas that we're talking about, but we have these Feshbach resonances which allow us to tune the interaction strength. And if we tune the interaction strength between two spin up and spin down fermions to very strong attractions, we form basically a more or less Bose-Einstein condensate of pairs. Or that's how I think about it, even if it's 2D. And there, when we observe it, so here you see again the transferred momentum in units of the Fermi momentum, and here the energy we supply in units of the Fermi energy. And then we see we can only, the heating, the relative heating, or this S of Q, also heating divided by omega, and you see here we can heat quite well. So if we drag the lattice exactly at the velocity that corresponds to the speed of sound or the critical velocity. And then the dispersion relation becomes quadratic. Whereas if we go more towards the BCS regime, where the interaction strength is not so strongly attractive, so more loosely bound pairs, then this experimental data shows us that there's again a phononic mode, but somewhere over here, there's a whole continuum of pairs, a continuum of excitations. And let's look at this data a bit more closely. So basically here we have these phonon-like branches. And then here we have this pair breaking continuum that we see here, or at least that we think is the pair breaking continuum, where we basically supply an energy that's larger than 2 delta. So I give a short sketch where this starts, then about 2 delta. So it seems like we could extract both the phonon velocity and the pair breaking energy from these figures. And first of all, let's perhaps look at these velocities, and perhaps not even the phonon velocity, but the minimum velocity with which the minimum slope according to Landau's criterion, with which one can here just the minimum slope. I mean, going back to this slide. Sorry, here, evaluating this figure to determine the critical velocity. And we did that. This is just a hand-waving way how we extract this. There's a bit more involved data available. I'm just skipping that, and for reasons of time. So from the slope, we can extract the critical velocity, both in the BC regime and the BCS regime, and actually tune from somewhere here, tune the interaction strength. So this is an interaction strength axis from deep in the BC regime. And the parameter is the logarithm of Fermi velocity times the 2D scattering length, and tune from the BC regime to the BCS regime. And then we see that here, these data points are the critical velocity that we extract in units of the Fermi velocity, that this critical velocity increases as we become more strongly interacting, then has a maximum somewhere here at 0, where the gas is very strongly interacting and then drops again. And why does it do so? I think it makes kind of sense because we independently measure the speed of sound, and the critical velocity increases as the speed of sound does, because the speed of sound, the more fermionic the system gets, the less bosonic, the stiffer it gets due to Pauli principle and so on. So speed of sound goes up. So here the slope becomes higher and higher. But at some point, then the pair breaking excitations matter. They are cheaper than creating a phonon. So basically you see here somewhere in the BCS regime, the slope is not limited by this slope here of the speed of sound, but rather by these pair breaking excitations. That's why it goes down again. So bottom line is we can measure the structure factor of these strongly correlated superfluids. They seem to be superfluid across the whole regime that we can access, although we can't really go deep into the BCS regime. And they're most stable somewhere in this region. With that, let me go on. And let's look at how can we extract the superfluid gap. So it somehow seems, this is another of these spectra, that somehow here there's an onset of these pair breaking excitations, and there's various ways to probe that. They're a bit detailed. So we can either sort of integrate the whole graph to the left, so integrate over Q, take this integral, so then we get this sort of line where you see that there's an right. So this is plotted against omega, this integral over Q, and we see there's a certain maximum when it can break the most pairs, or what I like even better, we just take a single line cut somewhere here, where you somehow can't see the pair breaking excitations at the moment. But in fact, if we very strongly drive the system as we change at a fixed momentum, our excitation energy, we see first as we go upwards here, this is this plot here, we see that there's a huge peak. This is the this is the Goldstone mode, the phononic mode. But then at somewhat higher energies, we see a second peak, which are these pair breaking excitations, at least due to our interpretation, which you can't see here because we don't drive the system so strongly, but here we drive it more strongly to see the second peak. And with both methods, we can extract, we believe, the gap. And let me show you this gap. So here is the gap that we extract in units of the Fermi energy, again, ranging from BC to BCS regime. And these are our data points. And some of them, are diamonds, some of them are circles. That's if we extract them either that way or that way, but it doesn't really matter. Both ways, as you see in the overlapping regime, work. But what we see is that we have a fairly small gap in the BCS regime, so fairly small gap here. Whereas as we go over here, this pair breaking continuum moves up to higher energies and becomes ever higher. And why is that? Well, because there's a trivial 2 body binding energy. When this is this red line, if we just solve the two-body scattering problem of two particles scattering with varying scattering lengths, the more attractive it gets, that there's a trivial two-body bound state which gets more and more bound. So somewhere in the BEC state, there's actually this two-body binding energy is about of that size, and then we need some extra many-body energy to actually break these. That's extra on top of the two-body problem. So the difference between these curves, so between the red curve and these data points, is plotted down here, which shows us just the sort of the many-body contribution to the problem, how much extra energy we need because it's not two particles, but many particles. And then we see this difference between the curves down here. The system is basically highest many-body contribution. Most stability of the superfluid is again here in the strongly interacting regime. And we can compare that either to BCS-BEC mean field theory, which is way off, or to two excellent calculations by Quantum Monte Carlo, one of them by Alex Getzelis, organizer of this conference, and one by the group of Shiwei Zhang. So these are the two different triangles, and we see, okay, seem to agree more or less, but not fully. However, I should point out these are true 2D calculations, Quantum Monte Carlos, whereas our system still obviously knows a third direction. You know, the scattering physics microscopically might be 3D. And we don't really know where there's a slight difference. With that, in the last 2 minutes, I'll try to be brief. Let me shortly show you what we then went on. Namely, we went, let me show you that there's actually also theory by Senne von Loon and Carlos Sademelo, which I'm sure Senne will show you tomorrow, I believe it is, where they compare our data, that's the black data of these spectra, with a theory including quantum fluctuations in phase and amplitude, and that's the solid red line, which I think you will agree is quite well describing the data despite the strong correlations. And I look forward to Senne's talk. But we thought about, well, can we now compare Fermionic superfluids in 2 and 3 dimensions? And so we compared data taken in these systems and in these systems. So these are spectra taken in 2D systems, BEC-like, BCS-like, showed you that. Again in 3D, BEC-like, BCS-like. But the question was, how do we compare these two systems? Because they have different, ways of characterizing the scattering lengths. So one it's ln kf a2d, and the other is 1 over kf 3d. And then an idea that came to, and for both systems, we can extract the gap as previously. So this gap here, and here you can see for a 2D system, this gap in the BCS regime, in the BEC regime, in the BEC regime, in the BCS regime, and this gap increases. This is the data I showed you previously. And we can also do it for a 3D system where the gap increases from the BCS regime to the BEC regime. And there's also previous data here. And we wondered, how can we compare these two systems? And the basic idea is, let's plot it against some parameter that's common to both systems. And one parameter that's common to both systems is the chemical potential divided by EF. And so we did that. And in fact, we didn't measure the chemical potential in this case, but we took theory input from 2 of those theories. So we plotted the gap that we measured both for 2D systems, so that's the blue data points, and for 3D systems, that's the red data points, as a function of the chemical potential. So in the BCS regime, the chemical potential is basically EF, right? So, or here 0.75 EF. Whereas the more you go towards the BEC regime, the chemical potential in the BEC regime becomes negative and ever stronger negative. So this is tuning from the BCS regime with small gaps to the BEC regime with large gaps. And the utterly surprising thing to us was that these two curves agree. So the red data points for 3D and for 2D agree. And this is not at all obvious. Just to show you here, this is the same curve, but with theories. This is 3D BCS theory. This is 2D BCS theory. They totally disagree, the naive expectations. And we can also, but I think I'll skip that, plot it as a function of this pair size. So we can plot this gap over EF as a function of the pair size. And that's our data here. And then compare it to data from 2D and 3D systems, all sorts of superconductors, and see that the trend is the same. The smaller the pair size in units of KF, the more strongly correlated the systems are. With that, I want to conclude. I've shown you that we can create 2D and 3D systems, that we can measure the structure factors in them, that we can extract the gap both in 2D and 3D, that we can plot them on top of each other by plotting them versus mu. And they seem very strange, and I'm happy for any input to agree, despite theory not saying the same. And we even can compare it to solid state materials. This is a plot I've not found anywhere in any other paper where we've tried to, where you see most of these systems follow sort of the Pippard coherence length. Yeah, and with that, I thank you for your attention, and funding agencies, and particularly the people doing the actual work. I'm just presenting it, for their work. Thank you.
So we start the question with the room people. So, Michael.
Yeah, hello, Michael Urban from Orsay. You showed a figure where you displayed the critical velocity as function of log KFA. And on the same figure, there was also the speed of sound. And I thought, if I have understood correctly your argument before, shouldn't the critical velocity in the region where the phonons are dominant be equal to the speed of sound, but it is much lower here? So can you explain that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael Urban, for the question. It should, from theory, be the same. So the critical velocity should be the speed of sound. However, there are several factors which contribute to the lessening of the critical velocity. One of them is this line width. I mean, obviously, there's a certain width of this phonon regime. And if we take that into account and plot it properly, we see that, the slope given to the center rather than to the edge of these systems is lower. Then obviously there's finite temperature, which contributes to, excitations at lower temperature. And there's this fact that we only have a finite size stir and several factors like these which push it down. But I think mostly finite width of this mode due to temperature. Hope I answered the question.
Yeah, if the chairman is so kind to allow me to ask one more question, actually, I'm wondering, you have this obstacle that you move through the gas, and is the critical velocity independent of the intensity of this obstacle? I mean, is it really linear response or not?
It is. We checked. We checked that it didn't depend in the regime where we limited the depth of our obstacle to a regime where it didn't depend on the depth of the obstacle. So we checked that it is linear response. Yes. Thanks.
We have another question here.
Here is Sandro Strongiani speaking. So actually, I had the same question as the previous one. So the difference between the speed of sound and the critical velocity in the BEC regime. So my question is whether if you're in 3D, you find the same or not?
We find a very similar suppression of the critical velocity. I don't have the plot here, but we have in-depth work also from Ludwig Mattei and theory comparison from previous work. We do it in 3D where it's quite a lot suppressed, unfortunately. And there it has also to do, and as Michael Orban already said, yes, the depth of the stirrer matters, so we cannot go to, that is a contributing factor, but there are several contributing factors: size of the stirrer, depth of the stirrer, temperature, and so on. And we see the same in 3D, yes.
So the same, you mean the same difference?
Same, also, if it's the same difference, I don't remember quantitatively, but it's certainly suppressed by a factor 2 or 3 with respect to the speed of sound, something like that. And I'd have to dig out the data, and I can, so
okay.
send it to you.
You are not, let's say, worried about this difference, and so because it's a fundamental question of identifying the critical velocity in the BEC regime in terms of the sound velocity. So such a big difference, at least this looks a big difference with respect to the absolute scale of the values that we have in this figure.
Yes, it is a big difference. I agree. We are not that worried about it, because at least in 3D, in a paper from 2015 by Weimer et al. From my group and Ludwig Mattei, especially in Vijay Singh, they studied numerically in a truncated Wigner approach what they would expect, and they saw a reduction which was mostly caused, as I said, size of the stirrer, depth of the stirrer, and temperature, because we're not at 0 temperature. So at least in that case, we understood it. In this particular probing case, we didn't look at it numerically strongly, but there's also no other data by other experiment apart from one by the group of Christophe Salomon, where they get much closer to the speed of sound relatively.
Okay, so I see that Alex has a question remotely.
So Henning, first of all, thank you for a wonderful talk. I have a question about the 2D gap. Could you go back to the slide? So you kind of discussed on the BEC and why, the quantum Monte Carlo doesn't quite agree with experiment. On the BCS side, there is this Gorkov correction. It's different from the 3D, but there should be a Gorkov correction. Like in the 3D plot you showed earlier, right? The experiment and the BCS do not quite match, but here they seem to match quite perfectly. So do you have any feedback?
So you're saying sorry, I'm not sure if I followed the 2D, 3D of the question, but in 3D, we certainly saw, and we discussed that in the paper now, 3D paper, that it seems to be that the theory agrees better if we take the particle hole diagram, so the Gorkov part, into account. So that seemed to point towards that the Gorkov, Milik, Khudarov corrections are quite important in the 3D system, but it was not conclusive proof. It was just an argument. And here, I mean, okay, the agreement is okay, but it's not perfect. And whether this is due to experimental errors or the fact that we're 2D, I can unfortunately not tell you much more about it. And that's the data that we have. And I'd be very curious to have quantum Monte Carlo data, which sort of takes a third dimension into account, but including the confinement.
Yes. And very, this, I'm a theorist, so I get to ask this question because it's very easy for me. But is there a way of putting an individual error bar for a given interaction strength?
Yes, and I think the error bars, I have to remember, but I think the error bars just vanish below our data points. They're certainly very small, but I think we put some and we just don't see them in here. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, other question online? Yeah, Carlos.
Yeah, Henning, I have two quick questions. So going back again to the critical velocity, how low in Q can you make your measurements? Right.
Yes. So that's a quick answer to 0.1 kf about.
Right. So the critical velocity is obtained by taking the limit of very low Q, right? So there should be also some uncertainty in taking this extrapolation. So would that explain also the differences that you see between?
Good point. I think, it would be interesting to see also how this width increases with increasing Q, because that's a limiting factor, and the width should increase as K squared, right? I mean, if in the hydrodynamic regime, the width of this mode should increase as K squared. We couldn't exactly prove that, but so at least for my quick thinking, I think the width should decrease quicker as we go to low Q. Even if you can't measure there, then the slope goes down. So I think that would not be the limiting factor.
Okay.
But I can't prove it yet.
Okay, sounds good. I was just try to understand, because you cannot really go all the way to Q equals to 0. Yeah. So that's why I want to ask this question.
Yes.
So the second thing, very quickly, also, is in the you showed this plot in 3D of delta versus mu, I think, and pointed out that there was a difference between that in 3D.
You're saying, are you talking about this?
No. And before that, and showed different theories. I think it's more like the theory question.
Sorry, I showed different theories. Oh, sorry, this one. This one,
something like that. Yeah.
Yes.
And so in all these different theories, of course, they do different things.
Yes.
So the question is, when you plot something with agrees best, is the one that describes quantum fluctuations. Is that correct?
So I should say this theory, the red one, which agrees best, is a theory by Hausmann and Zwerger, which is a T-matrix calculation, which agrees best. I think many people say that's actually quite a good calculation, but it's a fully 3D calculation. I think that's the main point I want to make, that our 2D data is captured by a fully 3D theory, which has no idea, which doesn't even know that there's some confinement in the third direction. So our 2D data agrees perfectly with the 3D data, and that's what's puzzling us.
Okay, I understand. And so that also led you to the statement that, when you compare the 2D and 3D plotted in the same way, they look similar. So it's somehow suggestive experimentally that this correlation is largely independent of dimensionality.
Exactly. Basically, we're saying that the gap that we see from all sorts of solid state materials, all sorts of different and cold atoms, all seem to closely follow the Pippert coherence length, or that the gap is given by the inverse of the Pippert coherence length. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of food for thought there.
Yes. Yeah, sorry to present it so briefly.
No, this is good. I'm just trying to
Okay.
understand the spectrum statement. Thank you so much. Very nice talk.
So I think we have to move on, but as a chairman, I am allowed to ask at least one question. So when you do your response and you make a cut on the Q lines, for me, the first thing that is striking is that it seems that you go from, well, this one is not maybe the best one, but yeah. So you go from ordered response with collective phonons to complete disorder, where you have a kind of multi-quasi-particle, multi-quasi-whole excitation. Did you try to see if you have a transition from order to chaos by looking at the response and scanning the Q?
I don't think I can say something sensible about that. Sorry, I guess I haven't actually thought about that question at all yet. So if we drive very strongly, obviously we have a lot of excitations, but we try to usually drive very weakly. Only this particular measurement we drove strongly. But I need to talk to you more closely, I think, to give a sensible answer. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah. Okay. Once you start to break pairs, you can do